buying seafood is difficult if you want to do it in a sustainable way. You want to make sure you know where it's caught. You want to make sure you know how it's caught. And sometimes the people that are behind the counter where you're ordering or the waiter doesn't know that information. That can be very frustrating and very, very hard to order seafood. But there are apps like Seafood Watch that help you make the right decision, help you figure out what to avoid and what's good to have on the menu, when it's on the menu, and when people know what they're ordering. So I wanted to bring on someone from the Seafood Watch program to talk about the Seafood Watch, the origins, where it's gone, where it's been, and just where it's going in the future. And so I have the pleasure of talking to Jen Dianto Kemmerly of the Seafood Watch program from the Monterey Bay Aquarium on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And one of those actions that you can take is buying seafood that is sustainable, that you know is good, that you know that when you eat it, you're not going to get that guilt trip that you're going to feel like all seafood is bad seafood. Seafood Watch spends countless hours and resources to be able to bring to you and show you what is the best thing on the menu to get from a sustainable perspective. It's all about transparency. It's all about science. It's all about data-driven decisions that you can make just by looking at an app telling you what to avoid and what's okay and what you should be cautious of. So I wanted to have on Jen Dianto Kemmerly from the Seafood Watch program to kind of give you the basics of Seafood Watch and give you sort of how they make their decisions on what to avoid, what you can have, and to have like a non-guilty conscience, a guilty-free conscience. That's the whole point, right? You want to make sure if you're going to eat seafood, you buy it in the right way and you're buying the right things. And there's a lot of stories in here talking about, ground fish off the coast of California, talking about lobsters off the east coast of the U.S. and how they use their data and policy from a government policy to ensure that fisheries are sustainable and to make sure that we are choosing the right thing for the ocean. It really helps knowing what's going to be in this interview when you're talking about using this Seafood Watch app. And so we're going to get into that right now. Here's the interview with Jen Dianto Kemmerly from the Seafood Watch program at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Enjoy, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Jen, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about all things surrounding Seafood Watch program?
I am, Andrew.
Right on. I'm very excited about this. We have yet another person from the Monterey Bay Aquarium on the program today. And this is an interview that I've been wanting for a long time. I have to admit, Seafood Watch has always been a program, an app. Used to come out on like a little pamphlet that you could bring to the grocery store or seafood market to be able to help you make better choices with our seafood, which is, we all know, I've discussed this on the podcast before. It's a very difficult thing to do if you don't have that information in front of you. And of course, we'll have to ask questions to the person behind the counter to ensure that they know where the seafood comes from and whether we have to avoid it or whether it's okay to eat. So I'm looking forward to getting into all that. But before we get into that, Jen, why don't you just let us know who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Jen Dianto Kemmerly. I am the Vice President of Global Ocean Conservation at Monterey Bay Aquarium. And one of the teams that I oversee is the Seafood Watch program. And that's awesome. What we're going to talk about today.
I am looking forward to it. So let's talk about your career in this. How does one start a career where they get into the Seafood Watch program? Was this something that you envisioned before you went to school for this, or give me the details on how you got here?
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting story because I started out as a middle school science teacher, but I was also a very avid scuba diver. And because teachers make so much money on the side in the summers, I had to work other gigs, right? So I would dive and got into collecting tropicals and spearfishing in the Florida Keys, just make a little side money. And throughout that, in the Florida Keys, at the same time, the Florida Keys was being designated as a national marine sanctuary.
Right.
And there was a lot of angst in the community about
I
that
heard.
because the fishing community was like, you can't close us down. And the government's like, we're not closing you down. And there was a lot of debate. And finally, all sides came together in agreement that if we don't protect this habitat, there won't be thriving fisheries. And that was so intriguing to me, so much so that I went into a graduate program and got a master's in environmental sciences and just kept with this interest in seafood and fisheries. And, you know, a bit more to that story, but long story short, Monterey Bay Aquarium was talking about the very same issues and lured me, pun intended, to work for their Seafood Watch program.
That was awesome. I think that's really interesting how you got into it. Now, when you did graduate school, did you still teach at the same time?
No, I didn't.
I was about to say that'd be difficult to do.
It's more to the story. So again, as a struggling graduate student, I had to work jobs, right?
Yeah.
So I got a job for an organization called American Oceans Campaign, which today is Oceana. And they too, they too were working on these very same issues with unsustainable fishing and the tragedy of the commons. And this is a public good. And there are so many people that are trying to fish and make a living, fish and feed their families. But also you have an environment that needs to be protected. So my world just kept coming back to the same theme. And I was just so compelled by it. And now 20 years later, here I am still working on these same issues.
Wow. I think it's really interesting how you go from spearfishing in the summer, in your summers, to working in an industry or a field where you are part of a program that decides, okay, here's what's good to eat or what's sustainable. Here's what's not necessarily sustainable. With that background, having that, usually we see scientists or policymakers or people in the NGO space, not necessarily at odds, but fishers not necessarily enjoying the company of, not all, but some who are worried about being having their territory taken away or their area taken away. That obviously, we go back to the 80s and 90s when the Keys, the Florida National Marine Sanctuary, was being created. That was a volatile era, with scientists and the fishing community. Going from that, having that background to coming here, do you find it gives you a different perspective when you're looking at seafood, like seafood choices?
Absolutely. Because I know it can be done. You can sustainably fish and sustainably farm seafood, but it really does take a co-management approach. It can't be one party or the other. It has to be government and the seafood industry working together, and civil society like NGOs holding those parties to account. And that's really what Seafood Watch does. Our expectation as a program is that resource managers, academia, the industry are all working together, because at the end of the day, these are public resources that we are using for human consumption. And we have a responsibility to do that as best as we possibly can.
When you got to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, when you were lured to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, was the Seafood Watch program in existence at this point, and were you working on that program if it was?
I was working on it, and it had just started. The birth of the Seafood Watch program is actually quite interesting in and of itself. So in 1997 to 1999, there was an exhibit at Monterey Bay Aquarium called Fishing for Solutions, and it talked about the impacts on the environment from commercial fishing and aquaculture, and just trying to really remind our visitors at the aquarium that, this is the last wild species we hunt for on a commercial scale. And that's going to have consequences. But there are positive examples about how you can do this without overfishing or without having such a dire impact on other species that live in the ocean or in coastal ecosystems. So it really was an exercise at showing these are the impacts, but this is how you can do it right. And in that, we started putting out a list of fisheries and fish farming operations that we thought through some top level analysis, and we can get into our methods today a little bit later, but we started putting out a list at our cafeteria in our restaurant about fisheries that we thought were, best choices and ones that we saw were having these big impacts. And no lie, these tent cards that we put out in our restaurants started disappearing. Like people were taking them. Yeah. And we had not intended for that to happen, but that is what was happening. And that's really how the Seafood Watch program was born.
Right.
It's pretty interesting. It was our visitors who started with their keen interest in like, hey, I can make a difference through my purchasing decisions.
And that's the benefit of having an aquarium where you have, millions of people come through, per year and be able to, they're like pilot projects essentially, right? It's little experiments of how people behave when they come up to an exhibit, or how people behave when they come up to a poster, or they have I guess I haven't been to the Monterey Bay Aquarium. That's on my bucket list, but I know the aquarium that we have here in Toronto, they have these TV screens, and it differs all the time in terms of the species and what's on those species. Like it's a constant experiment of I guess human behavior and how people interact with an exhibit, or whether it's a live exhibit or a non-live exhibit where people are interacting with things. Here, obviously, you're getting positive feedback because the cards kept disappearing. So now it's like, okay, how do we create? It was the next step is how do we create something that's portable that people can take to the grocery store or to a fish market or seafood market? Was that the next step?
Absolutely. And that continues to evolve. I mean, we started with these little pocket cards that would literally fold up and you could slide into your wallet or your pocket and you can whip it out when you're shopping. Or we even had restaurants who would put it, and still do, in their guest checks. But now, as a community, we use apps, we use our mobile devices, we use chat functions. So we try to continue to evolve how we get information into the hands of consumers, with the times, if you will.
Of course.
So we still have pocket guides, and we still have 200 plus zoos and aquariums across the country and in Canada giving out this information.
Yeah.
But we're in a digital era. So social media now is another way that we like to communicate with people who are interested in this information.
And I think that's a huge benefit, because if people are interested, they're going to continue to go back or, engage with it on their feed so that it continues to show up in front of them and it serves right in front of them, not only just in the app that you have on your phone, but also in front of you, in social media. So maybe there's something that you've always wanted to try, but didn't know if it was okay or enough. And then now all of a sudden there's a little profile on it and you get to see. We'll put the links to the social media for Seafood Watch in the show notes. Don't worry. Everybody will get access to that. I assume it's on pretty much every platform that people can find. Monterey Bay Aquarium is pretty good digitally that way. So that's always great. Now, we're talking about how to serve up the information to the end user, the people who you're serving, but how do you get the data in? So when you talked about first starting with, just these little pamphlets on, or these little cards at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, how did you get the data? Was it coming from just, obviously there's experts galore that work at Monterey Bay Aquarium. They've been doing that for decades. Is it just, you just ask some people like, what's sustainable? What can we put on these cards? Was it more anecdotal at that point or was it still data driven?
It was data driven even at the beginning.
Nice.
We're very fortunate in the United States and Canada to have some very strong fisheries management bodies with a lot of available data and strong legislation. So there was already a lot of information in the public domain as to the status of the target stock, like are you fishing tuna, for example, or salmon. So that was easy for the usual suspects of seafood that you wanted to assess, the popular stuff.
Yeah.
Then I think what was very eye-opening to us was just how much seafood we imported. And that's when things started getting tricky. We import upwards in the United States, upwards of 90% of our seafood. Yeah. And it's coming from countries and areas of the world or even the high seas where the data isn't readily available in the public domain or doesn't even exist. So that was the challenge. And that's where we really had to develop a more sophisticated network of experts really to
Right.
help us get this work done. So today, we have a network of experts across the globe that are constantly mining for information. All of our information is up online. It's all at seafoodwatch.org. The standards by which we evaluate the seafood, all of the science-based assessments, the reports, the citations, the peer review process, the public comment process. Anyone could really engage and dig into these assessments, because the more awareness we have of these assessments, the more data in. And that's really our goal here.
Now, how many people, I mean, I'm sure it's evolved over time, but how many people today work within the Seafood Watch program at Monterey Bay?
We have about 50 people working on Seafood Watch at any point in time. And just to kind of speak of the scope of our work, the pocket guides and these color-coded green, yellow, red ratings that you see, that's one piece. So about half of that team is just working on raising awareness, advising businesses as to their purchasing, and actually creating these ratings. There's another 25 more out there across the globe that are trying to take this information about where the deficiencies are. Why are you red? Why are you yellow? And trying to bring that to the industry and the government and say, look, this is where we need to make improvements. So delivering that information to the source is just as important as raising awareness with consumers and businesses.
Okay, I like this, where this is going down, because I always thought it was, if it's data deficient, it's just data deficient. You don't have the time or the people to go and hunt that information down. I mean, we know a lot of the fishing industry, especially worldwide, the transparency is not there for many of the fisheries, or maybe used to be. It's probably getting better and better because of programs like this. But at a time, it was awful. You couldn't get any information on there. And that was the big problem, is we didn't know. We couldn't trace it back to where it was. And I remember Seafood Watch at the beginning, it was like, we know where this comes from. Like we know that, tuna on the East Coast is okay because we can track it, where it goes and how it's sold and how it's caught, and there's reported on it and things like that. But how do you, when you talk about importing from other countries, how do you know that one, if they do provide information, that it's right? And then two, if they don't provide information, what do you do? So now you're saying you have people in your program that actually go to the industry maybe that country, you can correct me if I'm wrong, and then say, can we get more data in here so we can properly assess this? Is that correct? Is that the right kind of thing?
That is correct, but there's a missing piece we haven't talked about yet.
Okay.
And it's like, why the heck would they give that information to us? Who are you? Monterey Bay Aquarium? I don't even know where Monterey is.
Right.
It's between LA and San Francisco, right in the middle, in case the listeners are wondering.
A beautiful area.
Awesome. It's beautiful. And it really is. Worth a visit.
Yeah.
So this kind of comes back to why the listener should even care. And it's because if enough people, consumers, whether you're dining out or shopping out, if enough of you ask questions, the restaurateur, the retailer is going to start to take notice. Especially if you say, is this seafood sustainable? Or I don't want to eat anything that's like driving a species to extinction or taking food out of the mouths of a family in a developing country. Just showing that you care has really, over the past 20 years, Andrew, driven some big companies. In fact, over 85% of the largest retailers and restaurant groups in the U.S., they all have commitments now to sourcing from environmentally responsible fisheries and aquaculture operations. That's because consumers made noise and they made these commitments. So now the whole theory of change was, if enough people make noise and enough businesses adopt these policies to source only environmentally responsible seafood, the supply chain's going to have to listen.
Yeah.
And they're going to have to start getting some of their data into the public domain and enforcing legislation, developing new regulatory policies to protect resources and therefore livelihoods and food security, by the way. And that's what's starting to happen. That's why the data is more readily available, because people made noise, businesses listened, and the supply chains and the governments that work in hand with those supply chains had to respond.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of public voice.
And it's the beauty, but it's also the difficulty, because I want to ask, before I get into this question, how many Do you have access or to have data on how many users are you, or approximately, are using the Seafood Watch program in one way or another?
Yes, we do. Yeah.
And how many are we at? Like just on average, how is it measured?
Millions. So
Is it millions? Is it that much?
Oh yeah. So, I mean, we can extrapolate till the cows come home, or the fish swim across the ocean, whatever saying we want to use here. But, when we were 10, 15 years ago, predominantly handing out paper pocket guides, before social media really took off, we were giving out 2 million pocket guides a year. And then we would get picked up by, like, Warner Brothers put us in the Happy Feet DVDs and CDs, and that was like another few million. Product placement, and then social media comes along and it's like poof, right? Then we get all these like peaks of followings, and celebrity chefs got involved and they'd be on the Today Show. And so, we could run analytics and see how many people are coming to the website and downloading the mobile application. Usership is pretty strong, but I think the new opportunity for us now is in the social media era. How can today, with social media, how can the public, not just seafood consumers, but anyone who cares about species in the ocean and environments along our coasts, how we could all use our voice through social media to say, no, we still expect that if something is going to be fished from the ocean or farm raised, be it inland or in the ocean, that it's done responsibly. That's our expectation. And that way, that theory of change can continue in perpetuity.
Absolutely. Now, we talk about how many millions of people who are using this app. When the program first started, I mean, you have the aquarium, so you have millions of people, coming to the aquarium. And so there's a lot of potential there. How do you get people interested in taking up? Because you can put all the data you want. We've seen programs like this or similar, maybe not in the seafood industry, but we've seen programs like this start up. Data's put in, a lot of money put into it for the development of maybe apps and so forth. And then people don't take it up for whatever reason. Obviously, Monterey Bay Aquarium brings a lot of credibility to the program. And of course, reach. You talk about being added to, to movies and so forth. I forgot how it was in Happy Feet. I remember that now. But so how does the Monterey Bay Aquarium and the program work to get people interested in taking it up and giving that voice to the program, being like, I want to know that I'm eating the right seafood?
Yeah, we're lucky in that we are an aquarium. And I think I mentioned earlier, there are over 200 zoos and aquariums that have also taken this on. So our colleagues in the environmental conservation community, in the zoo, aquarium, and museum community, they have helped us amplify this among their visitorship, both physically at their institutions, but also in their social media. That has been critical, as have various influencers. And when the program started, I think really key to the success was also the chef community. I mean, it's the chefs that really make seafood popular. A lot of Americans don't like cooking with seafood. It's typically not their first go-to as a protein source. Most people eat seafood when they eat out. So chefs have a lot of control there in shaping our flavor and our palate and the types of seafood that we like to eat. So they really took on this responsibility in helping to ensure that they weren't having a negative impact in what they were menuing and selling to people. So food really spoke to people. And then folks, once they realized that this is something I can have a direct impact on, for the better or for the worse, just by what I order or what I shop for, that's a very direct action. So I think another reason why this resonates with people is because it's really tangible. It's something they can do just by a purchase or something not to purchase, or by asking questions. Just by asking questions at point of sale really shows you care. It keeps these businesses on their toes about at least knowing where their seafood comes from, let alone whether or not it's sustainable.
It helps. I mean, it gave me a clearer conscience, ordering seafood. I think before you just order it and there's a bit of ignorance when you first start ordering seafood, as a young adult, and you start to order it on your own, and you go to restaurants and you go to fish markets, and where you expect people to know a little bit more about the fish and where it's caught, and or how it's caught, and where it comes from, and so forth. And yeah, it kind of gives you that little bit of empowerment, being like, I chose right, or
Yeah.
I didn't choose, but I have a clear conscience that I didn't choose. There have been a lot of situations, Jen, where I have been in a restaurant and I see something on the menu that, piques my interest. And then I ask the waiter, hey, can you tell me where this is caught and how it was caught? Because I have my app out and I'm looking, or I had my little pamphlet out and I'm looking, and I'm like, can you tell me? Because I'm going to look it up. And they said they didn't know. The waiter didn't know. And then they went back to the chef. Sometimes the chef knew and sometimes they didn't. When they knew, I was like, oh, this is great. Like, thank you for letting me know. Order the seafood. Everything's fine. When they didn't, I just said, okay, just to let you know, I'm not ordering the seafood because I don't know where it comes from. And I don't know how it, and that's how I tell people, and sort of our listeners, is it's okay to not order seafood because they don't have the information. And like you said, it's that power and voice where if enough people say it, they're going to be like, we need to figure out where this seafood is coming from and get better transparency, which would probably switch their supply chain, I assume, right?
Yeah. And sometimes we like to put it in this context. You go to a restaurant, and what's one of the first things you get? The menu, but you also get the drink menu.
Yes.
Open the drink menu. You could see where that wine's from, what grapes, probably the whole life story of the vintner,
it was grown
right?
in. Yeah.
The whole 9 yards. And if you gave me 5% of that for seafood, we would be having a very different conversation today. Chefs, restaurateurs, businesses know a heck of a lot about their produce, about their other protein sources, and about their wines. Let's get that same attention to the last bit of wild animals that we take from the wild for human consumption on an industrial scale. Don't they deserve that?
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. Now, here's a question for you. And this is the tough part that I always have is I live in Ontario, Southern Ontario, and there's Niagara region right around here, which is a great wine region for Ontario. And we often go there every year and have taste tests and enjoy ourselves, a bike ride and so forth. And we get to our final meal, and it's a, couple course dinner. It's expensive, but it's fun. We do it once a year. And the chef will come out, if he or she is offering seafood, they will be like, this is why we wanted, like, if it's from Lake Ontario and we got it from Lake Ontario because it matches the soil type, and they put the interest in it. They put the effort because they're interested in making sure that not only is it sustainable, but it also tastes like it goes well with the grapes and the soil and everything like that,
it's
which
all
I find,
paired.
very, very interesting. Didn't think that would happen. And I was very surprised to hear that. However, there are a lot of places, restaurants that offer seafood that are family style places. I'm not going to name any of the restaurants because I don't want to put any of them on blast, but you know the type, right? It's not that expensive. It's good enough for families to go to. You can have a nice dinner out. The meal is pretty good. It's good for families like young kids and so forth. And you can have a great time there. And the service is usually pretty good. But the seafood is questionable in terms of where it comes from and how it's caught. Have there been efforts from Seafood Watch to partner with or work with chain restaurants, family chain restaurants, to get, and this could be even fast food restaurants that offer a fish or seafood variety, to implement these same practices in these restaurants?
Yes, and this is where we're going to leap a little bit from Seafood Watch to some of the global work that Monterey Bay Aquarium does. So, the all-you-can-eat shrimp, right?
Yeah.
The crab splayed, down the long tables. Most of that product is not coming from the U.S.
Right.
And that's farm shrimp or, blue swimming crab from the Philippines or Indonesia. It's coming from countries where, back to that data discussion earlier in the podcast, the information's not readily available, or the regulations to protect resources is not that strong. So what do? Just keep red rating it for 20 years and say best of luck I mean, that's not even fair to the restaurants, right?
Right.
How can the restaurants make a commitment to source sustainable seafood if they can't even get the supply of sustainable
Right.
seafood? So what Monterey Bay Aquarium has done, along with others in the marine conservation community, is gone to the seafood industry in those countries with our business partners from some of these restaurant groups and with retailers in the US and Canada and Europe. And we say, look, there is a market demand. If you make these improvements, this market will be here.
Right.
This is what the market expects. So instead of saying, we're not going to source this, we're saying, let us help you.
Yeah.
Let us help you inform what the improvements can be. And let's figure out how to make those improvements. And we have examples of this. If you go to seafoodwatch.org and you go on the projects tab, you'll see some examples of how we're working in Chile to improve farm salmon, or in Vietnam to improve tiger shrimp production. It's a long game. And it's going to be a 10 plus year process to make some of these improvements. And we can speak to why here in a moment. But if we lose the customer demand for sustainable seafood, we lose the opportunity to drive improvement. I can't emphasize it enough that if we don't have a persistent, loud public voice saying, we expect sustainable, environmentally and socially responsible seafood, the rest of this work can't happen, because it's that market pressure that keeps us at the table making these improvements.
Yeah, and I think there's something to say about, having a program where if a supplier comes to, Seafood Watch and says, hey, we've done everything we can to make this as sustainable as possible. Can you sort of review our practices? And then you say, yes, it passes. That's great. We'll put you on, we'll say this is something that you can go. We'll green light it. But there's also something to say, if there's a program, or there's been a particular seafood that comes from a particular place and it's been red for a while, meaning avoid for a while, and then working with that supplier and working in that country to make it better to a point where it's traceable and it's sustainable, to the point where either it becomes, it probably, I assume it kind of goes up the ladder, it becomes yellow, and then it eventually hopefully coming green. There's something to say about that, just from a legacy perspective of saying we were at once, this was unsustainable, right? Or even unknown whether it was sustainable or not. Then we brought it from being that, unknown to sustainable practice where people can feel better about it. It can get to that price point where people can afford it better and eat it at family restaurants or takeout restaurants and so forth. There's something that makes you really feel warm and fuzzy inside, I would imagine. With that, is there an example of that Seafood Watch has worked with in that respect?
Yeah, thank goodness, yes, right. I'll give one, in our own backyard. So the West Coast groundfish fishery, that's like rockfish and other bottom and deep sea dwelling fish, white, flaky meat. Everyone loved to eat it. Too many people loved to eat it because we were overfishing it. And the populations of those fish was starting to shrink. So it was red rated. And a lot of restaurants responded. And we was like, we got to lay off. We got to take a break. Allow these populations time to repopulate and come back. Well, at the same time, the industry and scientists and government worked together to hatch a plan as to how to rebuild the fishery. So because the market stood firm with their commitment to only source sustainable, they dangled that demand carrot out there. And the right groups worked together. And by the right groups, I mean all the groups, the government, the data was there because the research was happening, the NGOs, and of course the seafood industry. They were able to bring the population back. And today you have green rated, yellow rated, and eco-certified seafood along the coast. So yeah, the populations of fish, they can come back if you give them a break and you manage them well. So that's just one example of many, thankfully.
Well, which is amazing. And so you reduce the demand by having the people who participate in the program from the restaurant side, from the market, like the market side, to say, you know what, we're going to chill out on this a little bit because this is a problem, because now it's red rated. So we're not going to offer it at our restaurants, and we're going to tell the people why when they ask for it. And then they trust us more we get it back up and running with a bunch of other programs that go into regrow, for instance, for about lack of better words, a ground fish, fishery, and then bring it back when it comes back. And I think that is that's what's been missing in a lot of these commercial fisheries is the demand to stop for that fish, right? Whereas a lot of it's usually the demand continues and continues. So to have the people who sell the seafood to stop and have that wherewithal to stop is such a key thing to have that we've never had. And that's years and years and years of building relationships with those restaurants and with those markets. That's phenomenal. That is such a win.
Yeah, it's a neat concept. And, if this was a business taking stock of its inventory and it realized that its inventory was running low, it would do what it takes to replenish that inventory. And that's what we're talking about here. In some cases, the situation is so dire, either the population of fish is overfished or it's impacting other species, endangering them, or it's impacting entire ecosystems and habitats that other species need to survive. Those are dire circumstances that warrant action. So the market can make that demand. It's a different type of demand. It's not a demand for volumes of seafood. It's a demand for sustainability, which simply means we can sustain a healthy environment and industry and these species into the future. We don't have to deplete one of the three,
right,
to get what we need.
Exactly. I love that. I love that. That's so great. Now, with that said, there's a balance in balancing all these different stakeholders that are part of this sort of supply chain, right, from the source all the way to the end user, and it's quite the balance. Now, there are times where Seafood Watch have stood their ground and said, okay, we're not going to support a fishery because of a specific conservation action. And recently, in the past year, I believe it was this year, at the beginning of this year, there was news that came out that Seafood Watch, we covered it here on the podcast, the Seafood Watch was not going to, I guess, green light the lobster fishery in the Northeast U.S. I'm not sure if it was in Canada as well, but I believe it was the Northeast U.S. Was it Canada as well?
Yes.
Yeah. So can you just kind of give us a description of sort of what happened and what led to that decision, if you're okay with doing that?
Sure. I mean, this is what we do. It is called Seafood Watch. And I just want to remind the listeners that it's called Seafood Watch. It's our job, right?
Right.
Because we've got consumers and businesses who want us to identify when something's being fished and farmed in a way that's having an impact on wild species and the environment. That's what we do. So last September, we red rated 14 different fisheries up and down the coast of the eastern seaboard into Canada. And these were all different species. It wasn't just lobster, it was crabs and other species that are fished. Any species that was fished using vertical lines, meaning they were anchored or weighted at some point in the water column to the surface, and they were in the migratory path of the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale. Now, this is a species that since 2017, the U.S. government has identified as undergoing an unusual mortality event. And that means they were dying or being seriously injured at a rate that population could not recover from.
Right.
So we're at a point today where there's less than 350 North Atlantic right whales. It's very sad.
Yes.
But feelings aside, when this unusual mortality event happens in the U.S., I'll speak only to the U.S. example here. Our Endangered Species Act and our Marine Mammal Protection Act kicks in, and our U.S. government was required to issue some, I don't want to say requirements because that's redundant, but they had to work with the industry in the states to get the risk of entanglement of these North Atlantic right whales reduced by, at the time, 90%.
Oh, wow.
And the industry and the regulatory entities and the governments weren't yet at that risk reduction level. So we had red ratings that were driven largely by thresholds that were set by the government, and the industry and the states weren't meeting them. That's what drove the red ratings. So way back to the beginning of the podcast, we talked about the methodology and how we do these assessments. It is
Right.
very, very data driven. There's
Right.
laws on the books in the US that set out these, regulatory requirements for how we manage our fisheries. And are you meeting those government thresholds and requirements? And in this case, the answer was no. So that's what triggered the red rating.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people that did not know that process interpreted that red rating as, oh, well, Seafood Watch thinks that a couple of whales are dying, so we gotta protect the whales, and so we're gonna red list this fishery. But as you mentioned, as you went through, it's a lot of data. It's requirements by the government, and if they're not meeting those requirements, then as part of the program and the criteria that you guys set, is saying, hey, they're not achieving the proper rating. That's what the audit, I guess it's like an audit, right? They're not passing this audit, so we have to red rate them. Hopefully they can get to a point once they reduce it by 90%, the risk, then we can put them back on the green. Is that the goal? Is that really the goal?
Yeah, the goal is to reduce the risk. And
Right.
let's talk about what's happened since then.
Yes,
and
please.
We don't have to attribute this to the ratings. What we have to attribute this to is strong government action and industry action. And
Right.
remember the groundfish example I was talking about
Yes.
a few minutes ago?
Rockfish. Yep.
That's it. That's the success, right? So what's happening now, the industry, the state government, the federal government, researchers, they're all coming together. Nobody wants to see a species of whale go extinct. No one wants to overregulate an industry, right?
Right.
So they're all working in earnest right now to come up with solutions and regulatory response to this. The government right now, I believe, is in the process of adjusting its thresholds. So we will continue to do what we do.
Right.
Seafood Watch. We will continue to monitor and update the information as it becomes available. So that's what we're waiting to see. And we have seen this work before in other fisheries and fish farming arenas where they've been red rated, and then the improvements are made and the response is there by all the stakeholders to address the impacts.
So what happens when I saw these articles last September come out? Some of the stakeholders on the fishing side of like lobster fishing side in the articles seemed like they're like, we don't know why Seafood Watch is doing this, and other bodies. It wasn't just Seafood Watch. There were other programs out there that did the same thing. We don't know why they're doing this. What about these lobster fishermen in the fishing community? They're going to suffer and so forth. The article, so I'm going to say like the media, because it wasn't just one particular article, made it look like there was a combative nature between sort of the fishing unions and Seafood Watch. They were going at it. There was not a lot mentioned about the requirements that the government imposed and how they had to reduce the risk by 90%. How do you mend those fences between like industry? Is it those relationships that you've built, personally, professionally with the people to say, hey, like, we know this article came out, but we want to work with you to help you out? Is that what you rely on and kind of ignore the press for that matter?
I don't think we would ignore, anything. And, what we do and what we always have to do is point back to, this is our process. This is the information we used. We put it all out there on the web.
Right.
For people to see.
Super transparent. Yeah.
And, Seafood Watch creates recommendations based on our assessment, based on our standard, which is all out there in the public domain. So the audiences that use our recommendations or adhere to our recommendations can see and make their own choices. So we stick to our science-based approach. And as I mentioned earlier, we will continue to monitor to see how governments and industry can work together to really reduce the risk of entanglement to this critically endangered species.
I really like that approach. I think it's a great approach because it keeps you unbiased. It keeps you just, like you said, just data-driven, science-driven, and then let everybody work together to get back to where we were before. Because that's the goal, right? Is to make as many fisheries as possible sustainable with the information that we have and work towards getting more information to be able to do that. So that is I love that approach. And I think it's great for users to know that that's the approach when they're like, oh, all of a sudden it could be their favorite seafoods on the red list for a while, or not on the red list, but being red listed. And then you're just sitting there. You're like, okay, well, I can't have lobster for the time being, but I will eventually, because I know they're going to work together. And so that's good to know. And again, things change. Everything changes. The oceans are changing. I mean, this summer has been probably the most extreme we've seen in terms of sea surface temperature. So who knows what's going to happen with the state of fisheries in general. We're seeing fish populations move and shift and migrate, northward or southward, depending on where you are in the equator, relative to the equator, to get into cooler waters. That all changes, and that's a lot of work on your program and the people within your program to keep all that up. And I'm assuming that's all the relationships that you've built through academia, through government, through nonprofit organizations, through industry, to ensure that all that information has come in, and all those changes are coming in, so you can make the right sort of the right assessment based off of the information that's coming in, right?
Oh, yeah. And change is definitely afoot. So what we haven't talked about a lot is how our sources of seafood's changing. 50% plus is from aquaculture or fish farming.
Really?
Yes. And as waters warm, you've got fish farms that are established, along coasts, that their industry is changing. And that's impacting fish farming. You have a lot of coastal shrimp production, tilapia production, other species. Andrew, are you still there?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I couldn't see you for a second.
Okay.
I'll start that part over again.
No problem.
We also have a lot of aquaculture production that's coastal and inland in areas that are being severely impacted by climate change, flooding, storm events, and this will impact our seafood supply in this country. Because as we noted earlier, right, like a lot of our farm salmon, for example, comes from Chile, and their waters are changing. A lot of our all-you-can-eat shrimp is coming from India and Vietnam, and they're being severely impacted by climate change. So the Seafood Watch program has to stay on top of how this climate change is impacting the supply chain, but also what new issues are coming up. So as waters warm in aquaculture, there might be more disease outbreaks. More disease outbreaks might mean more chemical treatments. And what does that mean for the Seafood Watch rating? How do we have to update that information? Does the industry even understand and know how that's impacting their operation? So the need for research and monitoring and data availability and transparency. I know this is not the most exciting and sexy thing to talk about, but this is the reality of our world.
Yeah.
Like, we've got to be on top of it. But it's not like one conservation organization or just the industry. It's got to be everybody working together right now. It's all hands on deck.
Yeah. And I was surprised when you said, in terms of aquaculture and how much it supplies and how much it's, supplies our seafood. That's a very important part. And you have a lot of open net aquaculture facilities around the world that are very much going to change, in terms of temperature, in terms of ocean acidification and sea level rise and everything like that. And we've even seen, just from a territorial standpoint, in British Columbia, over the last number of years. And so I think it's really nice and I'm going to say handy, as in it's convenient to have a program that puts so much effort into not only maintaining the audits and maintaining the information that comes in, but also taking in all that changing information as our world changes quickly and probably faster than it ever has. This is a program that's well worth it to be able to follow and to be able to maintain and change along with it, and be able to say, hey, we have the ability to have confidence when we choose our seafood. Now, the last thing I wanted to kind of cover is, how does the Seafood Watch program deal with the whole seafood fraud issue that's been rampant in North America, where Oceana has done studies in Canada and the US. I'm not sure if they've done it in Europe. I think they have, where they've detected, 48% fraud in certain species, that where we think we're buying something as consumers and it's not that particular fish or that particular seafood. So how does Seafood Watch deal with seafood fraud, and can it really?
There's a few ways that we can deal with seafood fraud as a community. Well, one thing a business can do is look for the eco-certified options or certified options. And what they do, certification programs like Marine Stewardship Council, for example,
Mm-hmm.
so they'll have a chain of custody certification.
Right.
And they have levels of audits and assurances that that product comes from this fishery, it was tracked the whole way. You can have some level of assurance that this product is what it says it is. This is never going to be a perfect science.
Right.
But that is one thing that businesses can do. From the consumer side, asking questions, I cannot stress enough how much of a difference that makes. When I started, I was shocked to see how many businesses, when we started working with business partners, were not getting any level of detail on the invoices from their seafood suppliers at all. Like whitefish
Mm-hmm.
is what it would say on the invoice.
Wow.
And then we'd be like, is it farmed or wild? I don't know. I'm not kidding. I wish I was exaggerating right now.
Yeah.
What species? I don't know. And, kind of back to talking about wine or other proteins, this would never pass muster.
Right.
So in the United States and the EU, they now have stricter country of origin requirements. So programs like Seafood Watch and the NGO community have been trying a few different things. One, regulatory changes. Make this a requirement that this information has to be passed along through the seafood supply chain.
Yeah.
That requirement, by the way, listeners, is relatively new, which should be shocking,
Yeah.
but it's relatively new. And there's so many exemptions as well, which is even crazier.
Yeah.
But also certifications had to step in to provide that assurance in the meantime.
Mm-hmm.
But this is where the media and exposés are really necessary and powerful. And, I just got to hand it to the media. For sometimes, it could be like, oh gosh, there's going to be an expose. How are we going to handle this? But this is the public's right to know. And people should be outraged, and businesses should be outraged because they're losing money.
Yeah.
They might be paying top dollar for a protein they think they're getting.
Right.
And they're not getting it. And are those proceeds even being passed down through the supply chain? Is that very equitable? So there are a lot of questions to be asked. So I don't shy away from the exposés on this. I don't shy away from public being outraged and feeling cheated when this happens. This is, again, an instance where we have to make our voices heard.
And with that said, over the last couple of years, or even 3 or 4 years, we've seen an increase in the amount of, I almost feel like direct from fisher buying. Like there have been online groups. There have been, what do they call it?
CSAs?
CSAs. Yeah. The community, supported, I guess there's community supported fisheries or community supported. And they're amazing because you know exactly a lot of times they'll tell you who you bought it from, who caught your fish. So talk about transparency and taking away the middle people and supporting the fisher. A lot of times they're indigenous fishers. And so who you're supporting, the background, sometimes their families. It's a great way to ensure that exactly what they're doing. They know what they're catching and they don't have to go over or under, which helps the fisher sort of manage their money and things. Is that taken into account in the Seafood Watch program? Because that's relatively new.
Yeah, Seafood Watch cannot assess every fishery and aquaculture operation, right? So when if you're living somewhere where there's strong fishery and environmental legislation and requirements, and we're very fortunate both in the US and Canada to have that, and it's coming from a local fishery, and you are curious about your carbon footprint and you want to support your local industry, I think those are great choices. Again, this is about consumer choice and what speaks to you as a consumer. And what I'm sharing today is when you utilize Seafood Watch, when you ask just basic questions about where is this from, how is it caught, is it sustainable, that helps more than you know. That helps big businesses keep their feet to the fire. It moves supply chains globally.
Yeah.
Seafood's one of the biggest, most broadly traded protein commodities. Like
Yeah.
it's a big deal. It's big business. And the US market, the Canadian market, the European markets, when they make noise, the supply chain listens.
Yeah.
So whether you're buying from your local fisherman or you're asking a question at one of your biggest retailers, all of that helps. All of it.
Yeah. What a great message. Jen, thank you so much for joining us today on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It's been such a delight to have you on. I would love to invite you back on to get any updates on new fisheries and maybe dive in to specific, specific seafoods and in the future and say, hey, this is what we look at. And this is sort of an example of the data that we found and so forth. It'd be a lot of fun to jump into that. I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. This has been really great.
Thank you, Andrew. I've really enjoyed it. And maybe next time we can do it on site in Monterey. Huh?
That's tempting. That's tempting. I don't know if I could take the break from just looking at all the displays of the Monterey Bay Aquarium, but yes, I would love that. That would be
we
great.
could have at least one of our webcams up in your background while we do the podcast. So we can have a virtual experience. How about that?
I love it. That sounds fantastic. Thank you so much, Jen. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen, for joining us on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was great having you on to be able to hear the history of the Seafood Watch program, some of the examples that the Seafood Watch program has participated in to be able to bring more sustainable seafood, and also the amount of work that goes into bringing us the information of what to avoid, what not to avoid, and what to be cautious about. You would think it's simple. It's not simple. The amount of times where you have to build the relationships with different stakeholders to make sure that you can bring the right information, even putting some fisheries on the maps where maybe we thought it wasn't sustainable, but they worked to ensure that they got on the app to say, hey, you know what? This is greenlit. We can actually have this. That takes effort on both sides, industry, different stakeholders, fishers, as well as the program, the people who are in the program, which, as Jen was saying, it's still a small team compared to the amount of work that they do to put all that information in a way that you can just get and just be like, yeah, this is what we got. Like, this is our thing. And we want to make sure that we can continue that. So, I love this episode. It was more than I expected to get out of Jen in terms of how much information goes into it, and the examples that she talks about in terms of the rockfish fishery, groundfish fishery that we saw in the restaurant, saying, hey, you know what, this is on the red list now, or this is red right now, so it's to avoid. So we're going to avoid. We're not going to sell it. We're not going to purchase any of it. That takes a lot of gumption to do that, because that's probably a piece of fish that's very popular in California, very popular on menus, and to take that off, it could be a big hit. It's taking a risk in their business, and not a lot of businesses are willing to do that, but these chefs are in it. They're in it to win it for the ocean, and I think that makes it really important, as well as working with the lobsters on the east coast of the U.S. and along the eastern seaboard of North America. Working with the lobster unions, working with the fishers to say, hey, you know what, like, this is what we're doing here. We're going to work with you. And I think sometimes the press makes it look like Seafood Watch is doing something bad. But when you really look at the behind the scenes and who's working with who, you see that there's camaraderie, right? There's this partnership. There's this, everybody wants to make sure everybody succeeds. And the way to succeed is to work together and collaborate. And I love to see this type of collaboration happen for the betterment of seafood, for the betterment of the ocean, and for the betterment of conservation of the ocean. This is what it's all about. And I love that Jen came on here and let us know that it's a great program. It's a lot of work to put into it, but I think, talking about it on a Friday where we talk about action, this is something that you can take. You can take this action, use this information, and as long as the people you're buying from have that information, you can have a guilty-free conscience in ordering seafood, or you just say, you know what, I'm not going to order seafood because you don't have the information for me. And that will force that voice. Think about how many people use this app. Millions of people use this app. That voice actually has impact, right? By saying, I'm not going to have seafood because you can't provide the information. forces the waiter or whoever is helping you, the person behind the counter, to tell their superiors. That goes up the chain. Eventually, if more and more people that say that, then all of a sudden they're going to know where that information comes from, and they're going to do better at doing that. So that's what we're going to go for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any comments or anything like that for me, please DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. You can also go to speakupforblue.com, hit me up in the contact form. That goes right to my email. Leave me a voice message on the bottom right-hand corner. Just click on the microphone, and I will get back to you. But thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.